I'm Evelyn Carter, 68 years old, and I've lived almost my whole life on a farm in Harper County, Oklahoma. 160 acres of red dirt, hayfields, and barns that carried the laughter of 4 generations. For years, I thought this land would pass quietly into my son Ryan's hands when my time came. I believed it was our family's anchor, the one thing he could never betray. But I learned the hard way that sometimes the person you raise with love can look at the same land and only see dollar signs. I remember lying in a hospital bed when Ryan walked in and proudly announced he had already sold the farm. I felt something inside me go still, almost frozen. Instead of anger, what came over me was a strange calm. He thought he had won. He thought I was too weak to fight back. What he never realized was that he had sold more than soil and fences. He had sold something he didn't even know was buried out back. When I look back, I realize the cracks were showing long before that hospital day. As a boy, Ryan was my shadow. He trailed behind me through the chicken coop, carried buckets of feed almost too heavy for his little arms, and laughed when the rooster chased him across the yard. He once told me he loved the smell of fresh hay more than any perfume in the world. In those moments, I thought I had a farm boy for life. But things changed after his 18th birthday. He went off to college, earned a degree that took him far from dirt roads, and came home wearing polished shoes that never touched mud. He'd walk through my kitchen with his wife Lauren and their twin boys, and instead of looking comfortable, he looked like a guest in a museum. I noticed how his eyes moved over the property, not with pride, but with calculation, as if he were already measuring what it might sell for. I told myself it was just my imagination. I wanted to believe he still carried that boyish love for the land. But deep down, a mother knows. And the truth is, I should have seen what was coming. It happened on a Sunday evening around 5:10. I was standing in the kitchen stirring a pot of soup when a sharp pain cut across my stomach so suddenly it dropped me to the floor. I remember the clang of the pot, the broth spreading across the linoleum, and the humiliating sound of my own breath coming out in gasps. Lying there, curled against the cold tiles, I felt less like a woman and more like a wounded animal waiting to be found. By the time I was taken to Plains Regional Medical Center, I could barely sit up. The fluorescent lights made everything too bright, too unforgiving. When the doctor explained the results of the scans, his words hit harder than the pain. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 6 months if I was lucky. In that sterile room, with the beeping of machines around me, it felt like someone had stamped an expiration date across my life. I remember thinking not about treatments or bucket lists, but about unfinished chores. Who would care for the chickens? Who would keep the house warm through winter? It's strange the things your mind clings to when you believe you're at the end. I didn't know then that the end wasn't quite what it seemed, and that my son's choices would make everything far worse. While I was still hooked up to IV lines, barely able to hold down a sip of water, Ryan made his move. I didn't get long speeches about treatment options or comfort care. What I got was a son who had already put his hand on the steering wheel of my life, deciding for me what would happen to the farm. He didn't bring me comfort, he brought paperwork. I remember lying there, watching him hold those documents as if they were proof of how responsible he was being. The reality was harsher without my knowledge or consent. He had sold the land that carried our family name for 4 generations. He called it handling things, sparing me the burden. But deep inside, I knew it was greed dressed up as efficiency. The number hung in the air, $500,000. That was the price of my family's blood, sweat, and history. No mention of the roots that ran deep in that soil, or the memories that lived in every fence post and barn beam. Just dollars. I felt a coldness run through me, but instead of breaking down, I held on to something else, a strange calm. Ryan thought I was powerless, but what he didn't realize was that he had just opened a door he couldn't close. And behind that door were things I had buried long ago, things he had no idea even existed. The truth is, I had been preparing for storms long before that hospital bed. Years earlier, when my husband Walt died suddenly from a heart attack, I discovered secrets he had kept hidden. Debt piled higher than I imagined, college savings gone, and creditors circling like vultures. But in the middle of the chaos, I found something else, a safety deposit box he had left behind, holding papers that explained why our farm was never as poor as it looked. Walt had quietly protected the mineral rights to our land. Oil companies had knocked on our door for decades, and he had always said no. After his death, one came back with an offer not to buy, but to lease those rights. The signing bonus alone cleared every debt and put Ryan through school. I didn't want money to ruin us, so I chose to live modestly. Each year, I buried what I didn't need, cash sealed in containers, gold and silver tucked away in the soil of the very land Ryan thought was worthless. By the time he called the farm old and tired, the ground beneath his feet held more wealth than he could dream. And yet, the greatest secret wasn't the money at all. It was the power hidden in those mineral rights. Just when I had begun to accept the idea of dying, life surprised me. A week after the diagnosis, Dr. Patel walked back into my hospital room with a face full of apology. I braced myself for worse news, but what came out of her mouth spun my world the other way. The lab had made a mistake. My test results had been mixed with another patient's. I didn't have stage 4 cancer. What I had was a severe abdominal infection. Painful, but completely treatable with antibiotics. Lying there, I felt a rush of emotions: relief, disbelief, and then something sharper. Ryan had sold the farm thinking I had only months left. He had signed away his own inheritance for pennies on the dollar. And now, I was very much alive. That calmness I had felt earlier hardened into resolve. My son thought I was too weak to fight back. He had no idea just how wrong he was. When I walked out of that hospital with the truth in hand, I knew I couldn't confront Ryan head-on. He was too sure of himself, too convinced he had already won. If I wanted justice, I had to be patient, careful, and smarter than his greed. The first thing I did was reach out to an attorney in Oklahoma City, a woman named Sloan Whitaker. She didn't sugarcoat anything. She listened. She took notes. And she told me what I already knew in my gut: Ryan had committed fraud by forging papers while I was hospitalized. The courts could undo the sale, but the process would be slow. Maybe years. I didn't want years. I wanted something faster. Something that would teach my son a lesson he couldn't ignore. So I asked her to let me play weak, to let me pretend I was still fading. My plan was simple. Ryan believed I had only weeks left. If I kept that illusion alive, his own impatience would push him into mistakes, and each mistake would leave a trail. Every phone call, every desperate move to protect his quick payout would become evidence against him. It was a quiet war I was planning, and I was ready to let my son dig his own grave with every greedy choice. The following week, I watched the strangest scene unfold outside my window. At sunrise, Ryan pulled into the driveway in a rental car. He stepped out in brand new boots, carrying a shiny metal detector and a shovel that looked like it had never touched real soil. By the time the morning fog lifted, my son was out there tearing into the ground, convinced he was uncovering some hidden fortune. I stayed quiet, rocking on the porch with a glass of iced tea in my hand, pretending to be frail. He thought I couldn't see the panic in his movements, the way his clean clothes grew muddy, or the desperate look in his eyes as the machine beeped over nothing but nails and old beer cans. I gave him little nudges, half-remembered hints about the oak tree, or the fence line, or the shed. Places I knew held nothing of real value. And every time his detector screamed, he believed he was closer. Meanwhile, when the house was empty and I had privacy, I retrieved my late husband's old metal detector from the basement. Unlike Ryan, I knew exactly where to look. Behind the chicken coop, by the apple orchard, along the fence posts I dug with slow, steady hands, uncovering sealed containers packed with cash, gold coins, and, most importantly, the paperwork that proved the farm's mineral rights were still legally mine. By the end of that day, I had gathered more than $300,000 in cash, another $30,000 in metals, and every contract and bank statement that documented yearly royalty payments of $2,000. I kept only what I needed in the house and tucked the rest away safely again. Ryan never noticed. He was too busy chasing ghosts in the garden, too blinded by greed to see the truth right in front of him. I almost felt pity as I watched him. Almost. But pity has no place when someone tries to bury their own mother before her time. And soon, he was about to learn just how much his impatience had cost him. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the horizon, Ryan finally came inside. He was covered in dirt, sweat dripping down his forehead, and his hands shook as if he had been digging his own grave. He tried to hide his panic behind small talk, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He wanted to know if I remembered where Walt might have buried the rest. I let him ramble, desperate and hungry for clues, before I finally let silence fill the space. I studied him the way a mother studies her child when she already knows the truth. Then, slowly, I set down a single paper on the table, a mineral rights statement showing 1/4 royalty payment of $5,000. Ryan's eyes widened, and his body nearly folded. I could almost hear the math happening in his head. 4 quarters in a year, 30 years of reserves, at least $6 million in value. Maybe more. That was the moment the weight of his betrayal hit him. He realized he had sold a farm that was not only rich in soil, but in oil, for just $5,000. He had traded a fortune for pocket change, all because he couldn't wait. I didn't need to raise my voice. The silence did more damage than words ever could. I let him sit with his own mistake, let him stew in the horror of what greed had stolen from him. The money he had imagined spending was gone. The land was gone. And now the truth was sitting right in front of him alive, breathing, and unwilling to let his choices slide without consequence. That night, I knew the real confrontation was only beginning. A few days later, Ryan showed up again. This time, not alone. He pulled into my driveway with a moving truck and 2 men I had never seen before. They looked like hired movers, shifting nervously as they followed him up the porch. Ryan carried himself with false authority, talking about how it was time I left the farmhouse and moved into a better place. But I could see what was really happening. He wasn't here to help me. He was here to strip the house bare, to sell whatever he could and cover the mess he had made. I stayed calm. I had been waiting for this moment. As he tried to convince me that I was confused, that my health was failing, I finally stood up straighter than I had in weeks. I told him I wasn't dying. I had never been dying. And with those words, I watched the color drain from his face. Before he could stammer out a response, I stepped aside. Out from behind the truck came Attorney Sloan Whitaker and a county deputy. The deputy carried the papers: fraud, forgery, elder abuse. Ryan's name was on every line. The movers looked at each other and quietly backed away, realizing they had been dragged into something much bigger than furniture. Ryan was led down the steps in handcuffs. For once, he had nothing to say. And I stood there, not triumphant, but steady. The war I had prepared in silence had finally broken into the open. Justice doesn't arrive all at once. It trickles in, piece by piece, until the weight of it is undeniable. For Ryan, the trickle quickly turned into a flood. In federal court, he was sentenced to 2 years for elder fraud and forgery. The judge also ordered restitution. Every dollar from the farm sale had to be repaid, but the money was gone, scattered into a lifestyle he could no longer afford. His wife, Lauren, filed for divorce 3 months later, taking the twins and what little remained of their assets. Their newly remodeled house slid into foreclosure. The business ventures he had once bragged about collapsed as soon as his conviction made headlines. And then came the part Ryan never expected. Red River Energy reviewed the fraudulent sale and invoked a clause buried deep in the contract. Because the transfer was illegal, the mineral rights reverted back to me, the last legitimate owner. The land itself was gone, but the lifeline beneath it returned to my hands without me spending a single extra dollar. The royalties resumed, steady as the seasons, as if the earth itself was correcting the wrong that had been done. I remember watching Ryan leave the courtroom in handcuffs, shoulders slumped, face pale. Strangely, I didn't feel triumph. I felt pity, not for what he lost, but for who he had become. The boy who once followed me with joy in his eyes had grown into a man who couldn't recognize loyalty, love, or legacy until it was too late. The farm was no longer mine, but the lesson was, and it was carved deeper than any plow could ever dig. 6 months after the trial, I stood on the deck of a small home I had bought in Rockport, Maine. The ocean stretched out in front of me, gray and steady, its rhythm a comfort I hadn't known I needed. For the first time in decades, I wasn't tied to chores or harvest schedules. I wasn't waiting for anyone else's approval. I was simply living. With the royalties restored, I had the freedom to begin again. I changed my last name legally to Collins, giving myself a clean page. Here, neighbors know me as a quiet widow who came for the sea air and a fresh start. They don't know about the trial, or the buried containers, or the farm my son threw away. And I prefer it that way. Every now and then, reminders find me. A letter arrived from Ryan, written during his time in prison. He spoke of regret, of lessons learned, of wanting to rebuild. I read it once and set it aside. Because forgiveness is not the same as forgetting, and trust can't be forced back into place once it's been shattered. Lauren reached out too, not for herself, but for my grandsons. She asked if I would consider writing to them, letting them know they still had a grandmother who loved them. That I said yes to, because children deserve to inherit love, not the weight of their parents' mistakes. I've learned that family is not only blood. It's the people who honor you, respect you, and choose to stand beside you when it counts. Sometimes, the greatest treasure isn't buried in the ground, but uncovered in the boundaries you finally draw for yourself. If you've ever walked through betrayal and come out stronger, I'd love to hear your story. Share what lesson you carried forward. Leave a lesson learned in the comments if this spoke to you, and if you know someone who needs a reminder that healing is possible. Share this with them. This is my story, and now it's yours too.